I never thought I'd hear my mother's voice crack with fear, not until the night she called, begging for help. I'm Claire, and for most of my life, my family treated me like a mistake they had to live with. I wasn't the golden child. I wasn't even seen. But years later, when their world fell apart, guess who was the only one they could turn to? Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to believe in you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. They cheered for Ethan like he had just solved world peace. I sat in the farthest row of the auditorium, sketchbook balanced on my knees, pencil moving automatically across the page. Balloons bobbed along the ceiling, the banners rustled with every footstep, and somewhere under all that noise, my dreams stayed silent. The high school auditorium smelled faintly of popcorn and fresh paint, and the folding chairs creaked under nervous parents. Ethan's voice rang out from the stage, polished and sure, thanking the debate team, his mentors, his family. Every line earned a round of applause. I kept my head down, shading the folds of his navy blazer with careful strokes, catching the gleam of pride in Dad's eyes as he watched his son shine. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out into the parking lot. I drifted behind my parents, unnoticed as always. They pulled Ethan in for photos, Dad gripping his shoulder, Mom straightening his sash. I stood a few feet away, my diploma folded neatly under my arm. No camera flashes came my way. I didn't even think to raise my phone. Later that night, at home, the living room was alive with laughter. Aunt Liz and Uncle Rob sipped sweet tea, bragging about Ethan's scholarship offers. The smell of grilled burgers floated through the open windows. The trophy shelf gleamed under the recessed lighting, every golden plaque shouting Ethan's success louder than any voice could. I wandered upstairs to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. On my walls, there were no trophies, just sketches, dragons soaring across purple skies, ships floating above cities of glass. I pulled one down, a drawing I'd worked on for weeks, and carried it downstairs. Maybe, just maybe, tonight they'd see me. "Mom?" I asked, voice catching a little. She was refilling the chip bowl, laughing at something Uncle Rob said. She glanced down at my drawing, barely a flicker in her eyes. "That's cute, honey," she said, tucking a napkin under the dip tray. "You're always in your own little world. Make sure you finish your homework, okay?" I folded the paper slowly, fingers trembling, and tucked it back under my arm. Cute, like a stray cat or a finger painting. The next afternoon, we gathered in the backyard for a celebratory cookout. The sun beat down heavy, and the smoky scent of the grill clung to my clothes. Dad handed Ethan a shiny new set of keys with a proud grin, clapping him on the back. Ethan hooted and ran his hands over the sleek silver car parked at the curb. "And for you, Claire," Mom said, smiling tightly. She handed me a bright red tote bag. The words, "Follow your dreams," were stitched in thick, cheerful letters across the front. I forced a smile, murmuring thanks, and looked down at the bag in my hands. The fabric scratched against my palms. Around me, the laughter rose, the celebration flowing like a river I was never meant to swim in. As twilight stretched long shadows across the lawn, I found myself perched alone on the front steps, watching the fireflies wink in and out among the bushes. The tote bag sat forgotten beside me. I opened my sketchbook and let my pencil wander across the page, drawing the curve of Ethan's new car, the proud line of Dad's back as he admired it. From the porch behind me, voices floated through the screen door. Uncle Rob's laughter, Mom's low hum, and Dad's voice carrying clearly through the soft evening air. "Ethan's got the drive," he said. "He's going to do something real, something that matters. Claire, she's artistic, sweet, but now Ethan's going to make an impact." Something inside me tightened. The fireflies blurred into hazy little stars. I stared down at my sketchbook, the pencil dangling loosely from my fingers. Maybe dreams weren't enough. Maybe dreaming was just a way of hiding from the world that never really saw you. I closed the sketchbook gently, hugging it to my chest as the first cool breezes of spring brushed against my skin. Somewhere deep inside, A seed of resolve stirred, tiny and unnoticed. Not strong enough to change anything yet, but alive nonetheless. You don't need a slam door to leave. Sometimes you just disappear, quietly like mist lifting from the fields on a warm Midwest morning. The Bennett house smelled of cut grass and charcoal, the hallways buzzing with preparations. It was graduation season, a time of cookouts and casual congratulations, of relatives arriving with sheet cakes and balloons. The screen door banged open and shut all afternoon as neighbors popped in to shake Ethan's hand to hear about the future lawyer Madison had raised. Inside the kitchen, the table was piled high with gifts, cards stuffed with cash and checks, silver pens engraved with Ethan's initials, crisp blazers and garment bags. I stood near the sink, my art school acceptance letter folded neatly in my pocket, fingers worrying the edge of the envelope. At the party, Dad beamed as he handed Ethan the keys to a used Audi, shiny under the July sun. Cheers erupted, beer bottles clinked. Mom had even ordered a custom cake, blue and gold icing spelling out to Stanford and beyond. The whole backyard seemed to lean toward Ethan like sunflowers to the light. When I finally caught a moment with Mom near the buffet table, I pulled out the letter, heart thudding. It was from the Chicago Art Institute. I'd applied without telling anyone, afraid hope would make me reckless again. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice low, "I got accepted. Full tuition scholarship." She smiled distractedly, glancing at Ethan posing for another round of photos. She patted my arm gently, the way you soothe a child who's talking nonsense. "That's sweet, honey," she said, "but you know how you are. You'll change your mind next week. Better focus on something stable." She didn't even open the envelope. I stood there for a moment longer, letter crumpling in my fist, until someone called her name and she was gone, swallowed up by the celebration. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan creaking slowly overhead. The walls around me were still papered with sketches from years ago, worlds I had built and abandoned. I thought about my life unfolding like this forever, always almost heard, almost seen. Maybe dreams weren't enough, but neither was staying. In the weeks that followed, I picked up extra shifts at a 24-hour diner off Highway 12. I served coffee to truckers at 3 a.m., wiped sticky syrup from tables, counted crumpled dollar bills into an old mason jar I hid behind a box of cereal. Each tip, each shift, was a tiny rebellion stitched into my bones. There was no dramatic fight, no thrown plates or slamming doors, just the slow stacking of days, the quiet collection of courage. One evening, after another dinner where I sat in silence while Ethan talked about internships and law school rankings, I knew it was time. No one noticed when I left the table early. No one followed when I climbed the stairs and started folding my clothes into 2 battered suitcases. The tote bag Mom had given me 2 years ago, "Follow Your Dreams," stitched in gaudy thread, lay forgotten in the back of my closet. I pulled it out, brushing dust from the fabric, and slung it over my shoulder. It felt almost ironic, but it was the only bag I had that could hold my sketchbooks. I wrote a short note and stuck it to the fridge with a souvenir magnet from a vacation Ethan once won a prize for. "I'm moving out. Take care." No anger, no explanation, just truth. The Greyhound station smelled of diesel and burnt coffee. The waiting area buzzed low with tired travelers slumped against plastic chairs. I clutched my tote bag tighter, the mason jar of tip money tucked deep into my backpack. The bus hissed into place, and I climbed aboard without looking back. As we pulled out of Madison, the city shrinking into nothing but a string of distant lights, my heart pounded so hard it hurt. Fear and exhilaration twisted together inside me, a strange electric braid. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass window, the road unspooled ahead, wide and dark and endless. Somewhere beyond it, Chicago waited, a place where no one knew my name, where no one had already decided who I was supposed to be. I smiled just a little and let the darkness swallow me whole. Freedom tasted like cheap coffee and rent overdue notices. My first apartment in Chicago was barely more than a room. a sagging twin mattress, a wobbly desk jammed against a cracked window, and a radiator that hissed like an angry cat whenever the temperature dropped below freezing. From my third-floor perch in Lakeview, I could see the neon glow of a late-night laundromat, and if I leaned far enough, the flicker of the L tracks slicing through the city. By day, I pulled double shifts at a 24-hour diner down the street, slinging pancakes and refilling bottomless coffee mugs for students, cab drivers, and the occasional insomniac poet. By night, I hunched over my battered laptop, answering gig postings on freelance sites, designing logos for indie bands, pop-up taco trucks, anyone who would throw a few dollars my way. Most nights, the diner grease clung to my hair, and the only thing in my fridge was a half-empty jar of peanut butter. But still, there was something different about this hunger. It was mine. On a rare afternoon off, I camped out at a cozy little coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. Marcy's Cafe smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon, the kind of place where you could forget the weight of unpaid bills for a little while. I would order the cheapest thing on the menu, a black coffee, and set up at a corner table, sketchbook open, laptop humming. Sometimes I'd land a gig, a flyer for a local open mic night, a menu for a struggling food truck. Other times I'd work for hours only to be ghosted, the promised $25 payment vanishing like smoke. One blustery November afternoon, while I was sketching a logo idea for a secondhand bookstore that might never pay me, a woman tapped my shoulder. She wore a faded denim jacket and carried herself with the kind of easy confidence I envied. "I've been watching you work," she said. "I'm Marcy. I own this place." I scrambled to close my laptop, embarrassed. Marcy just laughed, a warm, easy sound that made me relax. "You any good at logos?" she asked. "I think so," I said, voice smaller than I wanted. She grinned. "Our sign's falling apart. I need something that feels real, local, like us." We talked for half an hour, sketching ideas on napkins. She liked my rough drafts, said they had heart. I walked out that afternoon with a small down payment, cash right into my hand, and the first real client contract I'd ever signed. I worked like my life depended on it because in some ways, it did. I poured every late-night coffee shop conversation, every clatter of the L train, every aching foot from double shifts into that design. When I brought the final version to Marcy, she beamed. "That's it," she said, eyes lighting up. "It feels like home." She didn't just hang the logo on the front door. She posted about it online. A few loyal customers shared it. Then somehow, a local lifestyle blogger picked it up, a short write-up about the heart of neighborhood small businesses. 2 days later, my inbox, usually a ghost town, exploded. 10 inquiries, then 20. Requests for business cards, website headers, cafe menus. I sat on the creaky mattress that night, stunned, rereading the messages over and over. The radiator banged to life, filling the room with its rattling heartbeat. Digging through my backpack, I found the first printed copy of Marcy's logo. It was still slightly smudged, the paper curled at the corners. I taped it carefully above my bed, smoothing the edges with shaking fingers. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a graduation speech. It wasn't a shining car or a family bragging point, but it was mine. I leaned back on the bed, staring at that piece of paper against the peeling wall. Outside, the city roared and rattled and breathed, and for the first time in a long time, so did I. "It's not much," I whispered into the quiet room, voice steady, "but it's mine. You think you've buried the past until it calls your cell phone at 11 p.m. The studio smelled like fresh ink and coffee grounds, the last echoes of a long day clinging to the air. My team had left hours ago, their laughter and hurried footsteps fading down the stairwell. Now it was just me, a pool of lamplight, and the low hum of the city breathing beyond the tall windows. I leaned back in my chair, rolling a pencil between my fingers, my eyes wandering across the cluttered shelves. Color swatches pinned to corkboards, a stack of logo proofs waiting for client feedback, a crumpled napkin doodle from a brainstorm session taped next to a worn photo of Lake Michigan at sunrise. Tucked into the corner of a bookshelf, half forgotten, was the old tote bag, the red one from high school, the words, "Follow your dreams," still stitched across it in stubborn white thread. I hadn't thrown it away. I wasn't sure why. My phone buzzed once, rattling against the desk. I ignored it. Probably a late-night deadline or spam. It buzzed again. Glancing over, I froze. The screen lit up with a name I thought I had deleted years ago. Mom. My fingers hovered over the screen, heart thudding too loud in my chest. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, pretending I hadn't seen it, pretending none of it existed anymore. But ghosts don't disappear when you close your eyes. They wait. They linger. I picked up. There was silence at first, just a soft, shaky breath on the other end. Claire. My mother's voice finally came through, cracked and unfamiliar. Not the sharp, clipped tone I remembered. Something rawer, thinner. I didn't say anything. I let the silence stretch. "It's your father," she said, stumbling over the words like stepping stones in a river she wasn't sure how to cross. "He had a stroke this morning. He's in the hospital. It's bad." The lamp buzzed quietly. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed, distant and lonely. "And Ethan," she continued, rushing now as if afraid the connection would sever before she could spill it all out. "There's an investigation. Fraud, mismanagement, his firm. It's all over the news. We didn't know who else to call." I stared at the tote bag, the one she'd handed me so many years ago, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dreams stitched in cheap thread, dreams she never really believed in. "We're losing everything, Claire," she whispered. "Please, we need your help." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink like stones into the quiet places inside me. The hurt, the betrayal, the years of silence, they all stirred, restless and sharp. It would have been easy to lash out, to throw her indifference back at her, to ask where her voice had been when I sat alone at the diner, counting coins, where she had been when my acceptance letter was met with a distracted smile and a pat on the arm. But revenge is a heavy coat to carry, and I was tired of carrying things that didn't belong to me. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. Then I hung up. The studio seemed bigger suddenly, too big for just me. The shadows stretched long across the concrete floor, and the skyline beyond the windows blinked in soft, indifferent patterns. Somewhere out there, a younger version of myself might have cried, might have packed a bag immediately, eager for any scrap of approval. But that girl was gone. I stood there in the darkened room, the city breathing around me, the past tapping faintly at the windows like rain. I pressed a hand against the cold glass and stared out at the glittering grid of lights. Choices carry weight, some heavier than others. Tonight, the weight of that choice settled in my chest like a stone, solid and unmovable, and for once I wasn't sure if I wanted to lift it. I left to chase my dreams. I returned to pick up their broken pieces. The Bennett house looked smaller than I remembered. The white shutters were chipped. The front porch sagged a little at the edges, and the once proud lawn had surrendered to patches of frost-bitten brown. It was December now, the air sharp enough to sting my cheeks as I stepped out of the cab, dragging a single suitcase behind me. Inside, the air smelled of lemon cleaner and something older, something like regret. The living room was almost exactly the same. Ethan's trophies still lined the mantel, gold and glass catching the weak winter sunlight. My mother had rearranged the furniture slightly, but nothing could hide how tired everything looked. The once glossy hardwood floors were dull, the wallpaper at the seams peeling just a little. Diane hovered in the hallway, wringing her hands around a dish towel. Richard sat stiffly in the recliner, his body smaller, shrunken, as if the stroke had deflated him. Ethan was nowhere in sight. I dropped my suitcase by the door and looked around, the memories pressing against me like old, ill-fitting clothes. "If we're doing this," I said, voice steady, "I need everything. Bank records, business accounts, full transparency." Diane blinked, then nodded too quickly. "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you need." I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the old habit of smoothing over cracks rather than exposing them. "Ethan's on his way," she added almost apologetically. "He's been overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. The word clanged hollow in the silent house. Over the next 2 days, I worked the way I always had, quiet, focused, methodical. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, a woman who had helped one of my early clients navigate a sticky contract dispute. I pulled in a crisis PR firm through a friend of a friend. I drafted statements, built spreadsheets, set up an emergency trust to salvage what was left of the family business. I treated my parents like clients, courteous, detached, professional. Richard said little, mostly watching from the corner of the room, his hands trembling slightly on the armrests. Diane tried to offer coffee, cookies, little motherly gestures that felt strangely out of place now, like props from a play that had long since closed. Ethan showed up late to a meeting, hair uncombed, his tie askew. He slouched into a chair and crossed his arms, eyes blazing with resentment. "Look at you," he sneered, after I pointed out a discrepancy in one of the firm's old accounts. "Playing the big shot, acting like you're better than us." I didn't flinch. I closed the folder slowly, setting it down with care. "I'm not acting," I said, meeting his gaze levelly. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. He stormed out of the room, footsteps heavy on the stairs. Diane made a small noise, half apology, half sigh. Richard just looked down at his lap, studying the folds of his worn flannel pajama pants. That night, after another endless day of triage and damage control, I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom. The door creaked the same way it always had. The walls were still painted the soft blue I'd chosen at 16, though now the color had faded to a dusty gray. A few of my old posters still clung to the walls, corners curling with age. Above the bed, the remnants of the glow-in-the-dark stars still dotted the ceiling, dim and almost invisible. I lay on the narrow mattress, staring up at them, remembering how I used to believe they looked like real constellations. That maybe, if I stared hard enough, wished hard enough, something would change. But the room felt too small now, the walls too close, the house too hollow. I wasn't the girl who once begged to be seen. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. The heater clicked and hissed, the pipes groaning with the cold. Somewhere downstairs, a cabinet door banged shut. I closed my eyes, the thin blanket pulled up to my chin. The weight of the house, the past, settled heavy on my chest. I had come back to fix what they had broken, not to belong. And as sleep pulled at the edges of my mind, I knew with a clarity that cut sharper than any of Ethan's words, this was no longer my home. Maybe it never had been. The hardest goodbye is the one you say without needing to. The thaw had finally begun, turning patches of snow into thin sheets of glassy ice that cracked underfoot. In the Bennett house, the air was different, lighter, almost expectant, but it felt like a mask, something stretched too thin over years of silence. I stood at the dining room table, sorting through the last of the paperwork. The crisis was, for now, contained. Debts restructured, public statements crafted, lawyers retained. The foundation was shaky but intact, a house patched just enough to keep from crumbling. Diane fluttered around the edges of the room, clutching a handful of fabric swatches. Pale blues, soft yellows, patterns too cheerful to feel real. "I was thinking," she said, voice tight with hope, "we could repaint your room, make it feel more like you again. If you wanted to stay, maybe longer." I didn't answer. I watched her fingers kneading the edges of the swatches, the desperation she was trying so hard to smooth over. Later, as I zipped up my suitcase and hauled it downstairs, Richard shuffled into the hallway. He wore a thick cardigan, the buttons misaligned. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked at me without the weight of pride or disappointment, just a man stripped down to something simpler, more human. "We got it wrong, Claire," he said, voice rough. "All of it. We didn't see you." I nodded once, accepting the words without anger, without triumph. Some apologies arrive too late to change anything, but they matter anyway. Ethan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, muttering something that could have been an attempt at goodwill or just another jab. I didn't ask him to repeat it. The front door creaked as I opened it. Cold air rushed in, smelling faintly of thawing earth and wet pavement. Diane stood behind me, hands wringing at the hem of her sweater. "We're proud of you," she said, her voice cracking at the edges. I turned, suitcase handle firm in my grasp, and smiled. Not out of spite, but out of something softer, something resolved. "I didn't need you to be," I said gently, and then I stepped outside. The drive back to Chicago felt like shedding a second skin. The familiar highway signs flicked past, the fields and small towns blurring into a patchwork quilt of muted colors. My phone buzzed occasionally, texts from my team back at the studio, updates on projects, casual jokes about deadlines and coffee shortages. As I crossed into the city limits, the skyline rose up to meet me, jagged and stubborn against the pale morning sky. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp air flood the car, and smiled. "Home," I whispered, feeling the words settle into my bones like a promise kept. Not the house I grew up in, not the family who had finally, too late, learned to see me, but the life I had built, stitch by stubborn stitch, when no one else believed it was possible. And for the first time, I didn't look back. As I watched the skyline stretch into the pale morning light, a quiet peace settled inside me. The home I longed for had never been a place. It was the life I had built, choice by stubborn choice. Sometimes the people who once overlooked us eventually realize what we are worth, but by then, we may have already learned to stand on our own. In this life, forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes it simply means moving forward without bitterness. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your own journey or reflections. I'd love to hear how you found your own version of home.